Following 20 years of service, I returned home as a decorated major from 2 tours in Iraq. Robert, my father, roared after glancing at the medals on my chest. "Will the mortgage on this house be paid off with that scrap metal? You are an embarrassment." He was unaware that the last command I would ever follow was to humiliate him. "You can call me Rachel Vaughn." I was finally returning home at the age of 32, having spent my whole adult life in the uniform of the United States Army. I drove the rental automobile through the well-known, worn-out streets of Lorain, Ohio. But it felt too quiet. The delicate metallic fragrance of rust from the steel mills that had long since gone silent permeated the air, which was heavy with the damp smell of Lake Erie. Everything appeared more gray, not as big as I thought. The entire town appeared to be covered in a layer of dejected dust. I stopped in front of an old-fashioned German bakery called Miller's Bakery. Steamy against the cool autumn air inside, my father cherished its windows. The world outside contrasted sharply with the warm, sweet aroma of sugar and cinnamon. The apple pie I purchased was still warm from the oven. Through the tiny cardboard box on the passenger seat, the heat radiated. On a frigid day, a brittle fake warmth. During long, silent evenings on watch in Baghdad, I had rehearsed this scene in my mind countless times. The front door would swing open in my dreams. My mom would envelop me in her embrace, and the kitchen would fill with the aroma of this particular apple pie, letting me know that I was at last secure. However, a familiar gnawing uneasiness coiled in my gut as I pulled into the parking lot in front of the 2-story house, its faded blue paint peeling at the corners. The home itself appeared worn out as though the energy of the people who lived there had been absorbed by it. I inhaled deeply, the orderly breath of a soldier, and proceeded up the crumbling concrete walkway. Robert, my dad, opened the door. He still had the strength of a steelworker. He was a solid block of a guy, but his eyes had turned as harsh and frigid as a winter sky, and his hair had turned entirely white. Not even recognition, not even a glimmer of happiness. He said, "You're back." There was no question. He spoke in a rough tone. Behind him, the sound of a hammer hitting metal shrank into the dark hallway, and it was my mother, Catherine. I noticed that Mom's hands were trembling uncomfortably on the front of her flowery apron, and my brother Alex was standing to her right, leaning against the doorframe with his arms folded. His costly, well-tailored suit stood out sharply against the shabby surroundings, and he had a smug, uncaring grin on his face. Nobody made a move. Nobody came forward. There was no hug. There was a thick, oppressive hush in the doorway. They merely gazed at me, or more accurately, at my Army combat uniform, like I was a stranger breaking bad news to them. I could practically feel the weight of the stillness pressing down on me as it grew longer and denser. I felt like a 10-year-old kid all of a sudden, having been found doing something that could not be forgiven. Despite the fact that I had done absolutely nothing, I made myself break the silence by extending the pillbox in front of my mother as a gesture of goodwill. I took Dad's favorite with me. My voice sounded strange to my own ears as I spoke. Apple pie. There was a tentative avian quiver of my mother's hand. However, my dad struck the air in front of her, a scathing, dismissive gesture. His eyes left my face and remained focused on my chest, the tidy rows of decorations and medals I had earned: the Purple Heart, the Silver Star, the Medal for Meritorious Service. He held up a hand to point his big, calloused finger, not to greet me. When he did speak, it was a roar that reverberated throughout the tiny claustrophobic foyer, rather than a harsh declaration. "You brought that scrap metal home for what purpose?" His finger stabbed the metals as he screamed. "Is that going to cover this home's mortgage? Will it be used to purchase your mother's medication?" His angry eyes flicked to Alex, and then back to me. "Take a look at your brother. He provides for his parents and sends money each month. You, after a dozen years of disappearance, you return with this. This worthless garbage." Anger splintered his voice. "You bring shame on the name of Vaughn. Bring shame to the world. First strike me, then the others. Scrap metal, useless garbage." Every one of them tore through my chest like a piece of shrapnel. Startle, pain, numbness. I could feel my face being drained of blood. A rush of chill washed over me. I turned to face my mom. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she averted her gaze and wiped at her cheek, perhaps to remove the proof. I turned to face Alex. He simply made a scarcely perceptible shrug, and a little sly grin briefly appeared on his lips. A shame. Hundreds of men had been under my command. I had been in charge of bringing the sons and daughters of others home, some in coffins with flags draped over them. I had wounds on my body and soul from standing up for the principles he professed to hold, the principles he allegedly instilled in me. This served as my welcome home. In an emergency, my training took over. You behave without feeling. You divide things into several categories. Inside of me, I sealed the burning agony in a box. I remained silent. Words have no meaning. In this house, they were a foreign currency. With a steady hand, I put the warm apple pie on the small, messy end table by the door and leaned forward. After that, I stood up straight, turned away from them, and left. I didn't hear the front door bang. There was no sound coming from within. When I got to the bottom of the steps, I stopped and turned around. I approached the ajar door, grasped the icy brass handle, and manually closed it. With a final silent and conclusive click, the lock was in place. I felt as though the chill from the front doorknob had crept into my bones. I was still unable to warm up hours later while sitting on the edge of a rigid bed in a budget motel room off the freeway. The scent of industrial cleanser and stale cigarette smoke filled the air. The neon sign of a 24-hour diner shone through the tiny window, illuminating the dust motes whirling in the air and casting a sickly green hue across the room. I had trouble falling asleep. My mind kept repeating what my father had said. Scrap metal. The words reverberated in the void within my chest. When did they start to view my life's accomplishments as nothing more than scrap metal? There was a lingering question, and slowly, like if they were ghosts stepping out of the mist, the recollections started to emerge. It began with the rooms in which we were raised. Alex turned his bedroom into a museum and shrine for his golden boy. Situation. The walls were adorned with framed honor roll certificates, football trophies from his days as the standout quarterback for the high school, and blue ribbons from track competitions. Even though my father was not very handy around the house, he had spent a whole weekend making and staining a unique oak shelf specifically for Alex's trophies. It served as the room's focal point and was evidence of his worth and promise. In contrast, my room was empty. My walls were painted a dull, unmemorable shade of beige. There were no awards or trophies, just my books carefully arranged on a flimsy particle board shelf and a big fading map of the world that I taped to the wall. It was filled with little red dots that represented all the locations I had always wanted to see. It was an escape map. When I was around 12, I once questioned my mother about it. I didn't inquire as to why my room was unoccupied. I inquired as to why he was so full. She had smiled at me with that weary, melancholy look, the one that always preceded an explanation. She smoothed my hair and murmured, "Oh, honey." Simply put, Alex is more gregarious. He enjoys sports and other activities. The reader, you're the silent one. She did this to make the injustice appear to be a personality trait or a state of being. However, it had little to do with our characters. It has to do with their decisions. For the first time, I realized that there were two types of children in our household: the one you merely housed and the one you invested in. The lesson grew increasingly severe and piercing. At the age of 16, since I was a young child, swimming had been my passion. It served as my haven, the one spot where everyone fell silent. And the power of my own body and the rhythm of my own breathing were the only things that counted. I took first place in the 500-yard freestyle in the state competition that year. It was the most proud moment of my childhood. The Morning Journal. The local newspaper featured my name and photo. I carefully cut out the small article with quivering hands, and then with a wave of jittery pride, I taped it to the middle of our refrigerator door. I desired for them to observe. I wished for their pride. It vanished the following morning. It was replaced by a brand new magnetic notebook with a hurriedly written note on it. "Football practice is at 4 o'clock, Alex. Avoid being late." My heart fell. I looked around the kitchen. With each second that goes by, I lose hope. While putting out the garbage that night, it was my shining moment, my name, my photo. Stripped with coffee grinds and resting under a slimy banana peel, it crumpled into a ball and was pushed into the trash can. I was so deeply offended that it felt like a physical blow when I approached my mother, my voice trembling. She didn't even appear to comprehend my anger. She waved a dismissive hand and muttered, "Oh, that!" All I needed was room for a note. "Rachel, swimming isn't a career, but it's great for your health." Alex's football, however, was unique. According to my father, that was his college ticket. My hobby was my passion. The future belonged to him. The year Alex received his business degree from college was the last lesson that could not be forgiven. My folks were overjoyed. They wanted to have his diploma framed in a massive, elaborate oak frame from the most costly store in town because they were planning a big graduation celebration. They lacked the funds, but it was a symbol. A few days later, after returning home from my summer job, I went to my room and placed it on the highest shelf of my wardrobe. I kept a strong little shoebox. I had it even though it wasn't much. All of my swimming medals, bronze, silver, and gold that represented the years of 5 a.m. were inside. Exercises and lungs that burn. To add a fresh ribbon, I opened the box. I had prevailed. It was deserted. I felt a chill of fear that was colder than any winter swimming pool. My father was polishing his equipment in the garage when I hurried downstairs. He didn't even look up from his work when I asked him where my medals were. He answered, "I sold them." His tone was informal, as though he were talking about the weather. "You? What are you?" My incredulity choked me as I stammered. When he finally turned to face me, his eyes were guilt-free. "Rachel, they were merely gathering dust in a box." His voice was full of tired frustration as he spoke. "That party frames Alex's degree as an investment in the future of this family. It demonstrates that individuals were sincere. His career depends on it." He put down his wrench and delivered the last crushing blow by staring me in the eye. "You must learn to give up things for other people. That's the role of family." In order to finance my brother's future, he had sold my past. He had converted the only material evidence of my efforts, commitment, and successes into money for a party to which I wasn't even certain I had been invited. The memories settled back in the green-lit, stuffy motel room. Like concrete, but not like dust, the medals were never the main focus. The empty walls and the newspaper clipping were never the point. I was the one. And all I owned was thrown away. They saw me as having simply functional value, not intrinsic value. I was here to be quiet, to avoid controversy, and to be sacrificed when needed. I got to my feet and went over to the broken mirror above the inexpensive dresser. I turned to face the weary 32-year-old woman who was staring back at me. The fluorescent lights made her face look pallid. I could see the firm lines the troops had drawn there, the faint scars. And I silently made an unbreakable pledge while staring into my own eyes. I would never again allow them to determine my value. With focus, sweat, and fire, I would forge it myself. I would create something so valuable and indisputable that they would be unable to sell it, disregard it, or even refer to it as scrap metal. It was more than just an idea that commitment made in the gloomy light of a motel mirror. It was an order, and I entered the United States Army's gates as my initial move. Fort Jackson, South Carolina for basic training. I was baptized by fire on my first day. Like a damp woolen blanket, the intense heat and humidity of the deep South enveloped me. In sharp contrast to Ohio's cool autumns, there was never a quiet moment. It was continually broken by the drill sergeant's thunderous yells. Their voices sounded like thunder and gravel. I was only 5'5" and a girl from a tiny town. I was adrift in a sea of hundreds of tall male recruits. I was followed everywhere by their gaze, with a hint of sarcasm and uncertainty. "Examine the tiny doll." As we stood in our initial formation, I heard one of them whisper, "The first week was a complete nightmare." I ran 5 miles and vomited from heat exhaustion. My new combat boots were stiff, and my feet were a raw mess of blisters. I couldn't sleep because of the intense, constant agony in my muscles. I would remember of this comfortable bed in my former room every night while I laid on the hard, unforgiving bunk bed and gazed up at the metal springs of the mattress. The peaceful coziness of Alex's house. Then, nevertheless, I would unavoidably see my father's disdainful visage. And I was fueled by that recollection, that burning rejection, to get out of bed at 4 a.m. and face another punishing day. In some innocent area of my heart, I wrote home once a week about the difficult struggles, the minor triumphs, and the things I was learning about myself. I remained hopeful that they would witness my transformation into a person deserving of their admiration. When my mother did respond, it was minimal and succinct on thin air, mail-thin paper that seemed as insubstantial as the words themselves. Here, everything is good. Your dad is the same way. Alex recently received a rise at the bank. Do not forget to stay warm. There were no inquiries about my welfare or words of support. Not one. You have our admiration. I once sent a formal picture of me standing at perfect attention in my dress uniform home. The only response I received from my mother was a little handwritten note at the bottom of her subsequent letter. You appear quite slender. That was it. I might be on the opposite side of the nation, straining my body and mind to the breaking point. However, I remained a shadow and an afterthought in their universe. It was me who required a reminder to keep warm. In contrast, my brother's financial success was praised. My viewpoint started to change. On a soggy afternoon, the base library served as a haven from the never-ending drills. I found a battered copy of Audie Murphy's autobiography, To Hell and Back. The tale of this little wiry young man from Texas who became the most decorated American soldier of World War II enthralled me. He was first turned away from several branches of the service due to his underweight. He fought not for honors or fame. He battled for his fellow soldiers the honor of his regiment and a personal code of conduct that no one could take away from him. I gained a moral compass from his story. For the first time, I realized that honor was not something that your family granted. You created it on your own. In the tiniest of acts, day by day. It was in your boots, which were polished to a mirror-like sheen that was more brilliant than everyone else's. That extra mile was what it was, while the air in your lungs was screaming. It was in committing one more rule to memory, one more bit of information that might one day save a life. I gave up trying to get Ohio's consent. It would never happen. Rather, I put all of my effort on gaining the respect of the men who were bleeding, sweating, and marching next to me. My first day of basic training. It was a clear and beautiful graduation. In my platoon formation, I stood at attention. My posture was straight, and my outfit was immaculately pressed. I was surrounded by family in the stands. The noises of happy reunions, laughter, sobbing hugs, and the anxious clicking of cameras were all audible to me. There was no family present. I was the only one in the crowd standing by myself. However, I didn't feel lonely for the first time in my life. I felt strong. Instead of feeling like a place of rejection, the empty stands where they should have been seemed like a place of liberation. My heart didn't spring with a yearning for their approval as the company commander shouted my name, his voice booming over the loudspeaker. For exhibiting exceptional motivation, discipline, and leadership, Private Rachel Vaughn is Bravo Company's Distinguished Honor Graduate. I didn't look at the vacant seats as I made my way to the podium to accept the plaque. I gazed directly up at the limitless blue sky. I was building with my own hands in the future. Once a sound of fear, the drill sergeant's shout now seemed like approval. I was alive, and this was just the start. Following graduation, I was sent to Fort Carson, Colorado for my first service assignment. Although the flat gray terrain of Ohio was a far cry from the untamed grandeur of the Rocky Mountains, the sense of loneliness I carried with me was same. I came as a timid, cautious private person who was resolved to keep my head down and work hard to establish my value. David Miller was my platoon sergeant, but everyone just called him Dave, a Texas Sergeant First Class. With a weathered face and eyes that appeared to perceive everything without ever needing to stare, he was a man of few words. The casual sexism was an immediate, if inevitable, problem because I was the only woman in the platoon at the time. Some of the more senior specialists started referring to me as Princess and would attempt to give me low-level jobs like cleaning the barracks while they worked on the cars. I never voiced any complaints. I simply completed the task and made an effort to beat them in each drill. We were doing maintenance on our armored personnel carriers one hot afternoon. The scent of diesel and grease filled the air. Henderson, a corporal who seemed to take pleasure in making my life miserable, unintentionally spilt, used motor oil all over my spotless suit. He laughed with a few of his friends. "Whoops." Henderson spoke with a false sense of innocence in his voice. "Princess, you'd better go clean that up." Before I could even come up with a reply, I clamped my mouth and clutched a wrench my knuckles white. A steady, quiet voice broke through the motor pool's cacophony. "Henderson, Dave was the one." The whole place fell silent, although he hadn't raised his voice. He stepped silently over his boots on the concrete, staring straight at the corporal instead of me. His eyes were dominant, inscrutable, and flat. Dave said, "Clean it up," in a tone that was low enough for Private Vaughn at the moment. He stopped allowing the silence to loom large. "You will never forget that she is your sister-in-arms after this. Not your line of humor." Henderson's cheeks flushed. He fumbled for a rag and stumbled an apology. Stunned, I stood there. For the first time in my life, I had someone defend me. Thanksgiving spent away from home for the first time. I was forced to dine by myself in the almost deserted base mess hall. I tried to ignore the deep pain of holiday loneliness as I sat with my plastic tray of instant mashed potatoes and lukewarm turkey. Two people paused at my table a few minutes later. It was Dave and his wife Sarah, a sweet-faced woman. "Not at all," Sarah said. She had a smile that could melt the snow in Colorado. Before I could object, we wouldn't allow one of our soldiers to have Thanksgiving meal by himself. They were taking me to their little cottage off base. The aromas of freshly baked pumpkin pie stuffing and actual roast turkey filled the air as soon as I entered. They took me into their house, put me at their table with their two small children, and made me feel like one of them rather than a visitor. I helped clear the table, played with their children, and experienced the pure, unadulterated delight of being a member of a true family for the first time in years. Dave glanced at me as he drove me back to the barracks later that evening. "We protect our own in the Army." "Vaughn," he muttered, "that's all we have out here." A few months later, my 21st birthday arrived and passed in Ohio with utter silence. No call, no card. I had learnt not to anticipate it by that point. However, my unit was waiting for me in the common area when I limped back to my dorm that evening after a long day of field training. "Happy Birthday, Vaughn" was written on a crude hand-painted banner that they had strung up. Additionally, there was an uneven chocolate cake from the candlelight on a small table. Dave held a match to the wicks while 30 rough, unmusical voices joined in to sing "Happy Birthday." My eyes began to flood up with tears, which I was unable to stop. They were tears of immense gratitude rather than self-pity, whereas those who owed me everything had forgotten they had remembered those who owed me nothing. I now understood those moments, the off-key singing in a packed barracks room, the shared dinner at a family table, the silent defense in the motor pool. DNA does not define a family. It is characterized by loyalty. Shared adversity forges it, and simply being present when it matters seals it. My brothers were these troops, these rugged, flawed men. We cleaned our guns in respectful silence, ate meals in the mud, and faced danger together. A birth certificate did not bear our link. Sweat, muck, and unshakable reverence were used to inscribe it into our hearts. My family was this. The cornerstone of a family is honor. Deployments, promotions, and the calm, steady pace of military life filled the years. The foundation of my universe was the honor I had discovered at Fort Carson. I progressed from private to specialist, then sergeant, and finally received my officer commission. I completed 2 demanding deployments in Iraq, where leadership lessons were developed in the dust and perilous conditions of locations like Fallujah, rather than in a classroom. I led a strict life. It had purpose, and much to my relief, it was. Fortunately, I was not surrounded by the insanity I had left behind in Ohio. My family knew the unwritten language of mutual respect and shared risk, and they all wore the same uniform. After almost 10 years of keeping a safe distance, the past finally called one evening. I was looking over after-action reports at my command post in Baghdad. The combined weight of my equipment and the fatigue from an 18-hour patrol left my body feeling heavy. My adrenaline-fueled thinking is still acute. The sharp silence of the tent was abruptly broken by the buzzing of the satellite phone on my desk. I looked at the screen. It was a Cleveland number. "Alex, my brother, it has been nearly 2 years since we last spoke. Not since a short, uncomfortable phone chat on my mom's birthday. When I responded, his voice was smooth with a strange, cloying sweetness that made my teeth tense. Rachel, younger sister, no talk for a long time. Hello, I've heard that you're doing fantastically there. I stayed silent, my defenses immediately and naturally raised true hero stuff. The flattery seemed like a shoddy mask. It was not a call to socialize. In my bones, I knew it. He continued to make meaningless small talk about the Ohio weather and the Cleveland Browns' current situation before getting right to the topic. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper as though he were sharing a state secret with me and whispered, "Listen, Rich, I have a fantastic opportunity. Right downtown, a huge real estate development deal. It's a given, an absolute triumph. The bank, however, you are aware of their nature. They require a bit more protection. For the loan, I need a cosigner." He took a deliberate pause to process the request. "And you know the bank would approve it right away because of your flawless credit and steady military job. Really, it's simply a formality." The receiver was cold against my ear, and I was unable to speak. As a soldier sitting in a combat zone half a world away, he was calling me from the climate-controlled security of his suburban home and asking me to jeopardize my entire financial future. I had meticulously and freely constructed my own future on a hazy commercial agreement about which I understood nothing. His speech took on a tinge of panic, so I guess I paused too long. "Wait a moment, Mom would like to speak with you." Alex spoke hastily, as though he were using a trump card. My mother's voice was on the line, shaking with a dramatic fragility that had been studied. I was all too familiar. "Your father is here, Rachel Honey." She spoke with unspoken tears in her voice. "His heart, it isn't performing very well. The doctor advises him to stay away from all forms of stress." With pity, her voice cracked. "This is Alex's project. We'd have some security at last. Knowing that we were taken care of allowed your father to finally relax." Her voice fell to a whisper of guilt as she delivered the last planned stroke. "Do you not desire some peace for your father? You owe the family that much after all. You owe your family." Like a dull knife, the words twisted in my stomach. Owed them? I owed them what? Aside from my own birth's inconvenience, they were forcing my hand by holding my father's health hostage and using it as emotional blackmail. Inside me, a violent war raged. I was now a disciplined officer. The woman who worked as a threat assessor realized that this was a trap. But deep down, the lonely kid who had previously tacked a newspaper piece to the refrigerator still longed for their affection. That stupid kid might have muttered, "They will eventually see you jumbled and torn if you do this." The only thing that made sense was what I did. I hung up with a vague response and promptly called the one person I had complete faith in. I gave Dave Miller a call. Once a master sergeant, he is now a genuine friend and mentor. I gave him the rundown on everything. My tone was clinical and bland, as though I were discussing a strategic issue instead of the betrayal of my own family. Dave patiently and uninterruptedly listened. His reaction after I was done was direct and quick. "Don't be a fool who can smell bad from a mile away, Rachel. You should look into him. Give me a call." With his contacts. It took very little time. When the reality finally surfaced, it was more repulsive than I had ever imagined, speculative and high risk. Alex's great opportunity was a gamble. He was drowning in debt after suffering enormous disastrous stock market losses. It was not an investment loan to make up for his losses. The bailout was desperate. They were lying. Each and every one. A distinct icy anger descended upon me. It wasn't a wounded child's heated weeping rage. It was the cold rage of a betrayed soldier. They did more than simply treat me rudely. To protect themselves, they were willing to deliberately ruin me, my future, my honor, and my stability. They may take advantage of it like any other resource. The swimming medals in the shoebox are the same. My mind made up my heart imprisoned in ice that night. I returned the call. False optimism filled Alex's voice as he responded. I interrupted him in the middle. "No" is the response. With a voice as firm and unyielding as ice, I spoke. "Nothing will be signed by me." Immediately, the phony charm disappeared. He began to yell, his voice growing shrill with entitlement, calling me a disgrace, selfish, and ungrateful. My father's well-known roar flooded my ear when the phone was taken away. "You are not my daughter," he yelled. The line then stopped working. I didn't feel any discomfort this time. There was no new heartache, no shock. All that was present was a deep, icy sensation of relief. Finally, the last ragged thread that had held me to them for all my life had broken. And it was they that ended the years of silence that followed that last pivotal phone call. I was promoted to major and then captain. The Pentagon was where I was stationed. A world of policy and strategy that seemed worlds apart from the unfiltered feelings of my past. My shield was the quiet fulfillment of my work, and Ohio's silence was a welcome addition. Then came an invitation. It had beautiful flowing calligraphy on thick cream-colored cardboard. Alex was getting married. The invitation stated that a renowned golf club in a posh Cleveland suburb would host the reception. A shard of optimism, as flimsy and dangerous as a desert mirage flickering to life, briefly emerged as a tiny fracture in the wall I had so meticulously built around my heart. A wedding, a fresh start. Perhaps he would develop with marriage. Against my better judgment, perhaps this was their attempt to reach out and offer a chance to ultimately put our family's broken parts back together. I made the decision to go. I bought a gorgeous floor-length navy blue gown and an absurdly pricey crystal vase as a wedding present with a week's wages. I wanted to prove to them that I wasn't the failure they had recalled. I wanted to enter a room with them one final time and be treated like family rather than as a duty. Ironically, it tasted like a physical flavor when I realized how bitter it was. On the Saturday of Memorial Day weekend, the wedding took place. My former troop was conducting a somber service at Arlington National Cemetery that same weekend. They were dedicating a memorial plaque in honor of the troops who had died in Afghanistan during a bloody, lengthy conflict. I had been fortunate to survive a war that I had led. My responsibility was obvious, yet the naive optimism remained. I called my mother and explained the situation in a cool, collected voice. That morning, I would go to Arlington for the service, honoring my dead men. After that, I would make the long travel to attend the wedding reception that night. She gave a desperate begging whine in return. "Rachel, you must be present. You must! If you fail to attend your own brother's wedding, your father will never forgive you." For several strangers, unknown people. The word lingered between us, filthy and frigid. The guys who had perished under my leadership were those strangers. The brothers who had perished in the dust of Afghanistan, so that I and others may return home. I remained silent, and the queue went cold. I fulfilled my promise. The Arlington service was a haze of devastating loss, white marble, and dress blues. I stood with my men's families, feeling their grief and sorrows in a respectful manner. Then I completed my task, fueled by coffee and that last obstinate glimmer of optimism. I got into my car and drove for 8 hours straight. I got to the golf club just as they were serving the main meal. The ballroom was a glistening display of ice sculptures and lighting. I was worn out. The recollections of the morning weighed heavily on my emotions. However, I straightened my dress, smiled courteously, and walked over to the head table. There was nowhere for me, but the crystal felt heavy in my palms. 8 people were seated at the circular table. Holding court, my father sat at its head. My mom was sitting next to him, grinning. Alex was glowing, as was his new bride. Her parents were present, as well as her brother. Every seat was occupied. In the bright glow of the reception, I stood there invisible, a ghost in a navy blue dress. Alex's attention was now on me. He gave me a frustrated, rather than surprised face. He exclaimed loudly enough for everyone at the table to hear, "Oh, you actually came! I assumed you were preoccupied with your essential matters." He made hazy motions around the room. "We're filled here, sorry. I suppose you'll have to look elsewhere for an empty seat." My dad heard. He let out a low, rumbling laugh and reclined in his chair. He said to the laughing table, "She's used to roughing it in the field. She is able to sit any place." Their laughter rippled over me, gentle and harsh. It knocked the air out of my lungs like a physical blow. Hot and angry, the blood surged to my head. This wasn't only a mistake. It was more than a slight. My service was being turned over, my offering. I turned the exact remembrance of the folks I had just lamented that morning into a party joke. I examined each of their faces individually, noticing Alex's gloating, smug smile, the complicit silence of my mother, her eyes avoiding eye contact, my father's blatant, unmasked disdain, and a remark from Theodore Roosevelt that I had committed to memory years before reverberated in my head throughout that heartbreaking, terrible time. The critic doesn't matter. The credit should go to the man in the arena whose face is smeared with blood, sweat, and dust. The critic wasn't me. The dust from Afghanistan was still on my face, and I was the woman in the arena. I inhaled deeply to regain my composure. I didn't scream or weep. I didn't cause any trouble. I just ignored them, moved to an adjacent gift table, and arranged the pricey crystal vase with the other gifts. After that, I left the ballroom without turning around. I went outside into the parking lot's refreshing night air. Behind me, the party's noise faded. How would you have responded? Would you have simply left in your car for the rest of your life, allow the shame and rage to consume you? I didn't. I took out my phone from within my purse. In the darkness, the screen is blazing. Silent retreat was no longer an option. The days of putting up with their rudeness were over. I wasn't simply walking away. I intended to rid my life of them, and I would do it in a way that they would never be able to ignore. It was a quiet and concentrated drive back to my flat in Washington, D.C. The parking lot's rage had subsided and hardened into a pointy object, a strategy. No more tears fell. Emotion was out of the question. It was time to take action. I did not unpack my dress when I returned to my clean, orderly flat. I immediately proceeded to a sturdy footlocker that was kept beneath my bed. They had attempted to destroy my personal archive of a life. Everything was carefully arranged in waterproof bags when I opened the top. I produced a folder with the name family on it. I removed my mother's collection of thin letters, each of which was evidence of her lack of interest. I printed out years' worth of phone logs from my laptop, noting every call I had made that was not answered, and every call they had made that concluded with a demand for money. My father sold the truck years ago without my consent, and I discovered the faded carbon copy bill of sale. I called a reliable acquaintance from my previous unit who is currently employed in finance and requested him to obtain all available public records regarding Alex's unsuccessful business endeavors. Every paper document and digital record included intelligence. Every truth served as more ammunition. It was no longer a tumultuous family argument. I would carry out this operation with the accuracy of a professional military officer. You don't enter a combat alone, though, as even the best officer is aware. Allies are necessary. I flew to Washington, D.C. a few days later and entered an office complex close to Capitol Hill. Now retired from the Army, Dave Miller served as a senior advisor to a Veterans Affairs Senate committee. I didn't hug him or cry when I greeted him. I remarked, "Dave, I need to brief you on a situation," as I entered and set a neatly arranged binder on his desk. I made my case as an officer laying out a strategy rather than as a heartbroken daughter. I presented the proof, the neglect chronology, the financial exploitation, and the last humiliation in front of the public. Dave paid attention. The more pages I turned, the more terrible his face became. He examined the timetable of events, the financial reports, and the phone logs. He shut the binder after I was done and gave me a direct look. His face was as rigid as stone. He said in a stern, low voice, "They went too far, Rachel. This is no longer a family issue. This is disrespectful to your outfit and constitutes abuse." He bent over. "What are you trying to achieve?" I said that once and for all, to be honest. Slowly, he nodded. "Then I'm with you. As a fellow soldier as well as your buddy, we defend our own." As we got ready over the next few weeks, a long-forgotten email appeared in my government mailbox. The Pentagon sent out the official notice months ago, but it got lost in the deluge of daily briefings. It announced that the president would be recognizing a few officers for their strategic silent contributions to national security at a ceremony soon. I was shocked to learn that my name was on the shortlist for the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Initially, I wanted to remove it. This whole ordeal was brought on by medals. All they were was scrap metal. I no longer required a bit of brass and ribbon to validate me, but then I had a thought, a strategic option so powerful that I was astounded. What if I wasn't merely taken into account? What if I did get picked? What if the most high-level announcement of my career service and honor were made on national television? They were rejoicing in their own small victories at the same time. It would not be retaliation. It would be a fact, an indisputable fact. It was the ideal weapon, a silver bullet. I started getting ready for a fight I wasn't even certain I would be in right away. I asked Dave to discreetly ask about the selection process using his contacts. I began writing my own story for me, not a speech. I kept track of every little thing, every lonesome holiday, every contemptuous remark, and every money sent that was never returned. My mind had to be clear and prepared with the information. I was no longer the abandoned Ohio daughter Rachel Vaughn. As Major Vaughn, I oversaw the AIM, Operation Truth, the most significant operation of my life. I was done being silent. The world needed to pay attention. I waited in a quiet waiting area in the White House's East Wing on the morning of the event. The cloth of my Army service uniform was strong and crisp, and it was in perfect condition. The familiar weight of my medals on my chest reminded me that they were anchors to a purposeful existence, rather than scrap metal. I breathed steadily and slowly. In my thoughts, a single line from Matthew's Gospel echoed a word I'd clung to over the long hours of preparation, a practiced calm I'd acquired under fire. Nothing is hidden that won't be discovered, and no secret that won't be known. I knew my family was getting together in Ohio, 300 miles away at that same moment. I had read about the event on the internet. At the same country club where Alex had gotten married, they were hosting a sumptuous brunch to commemorate my parents' 45th wedding anniversary. The menu was an extravagant symphony: tails of lobsters, mignon filet, champagne without end. It was a world of fake joy and performative prosperity. In contrast, my world was one of honor, earned through labor and sweat, and one of calm, solemn dignity. Dave was sitting next to me, his clothes immaculately ironed. He extended his arm and squeezed my hand tightly. "General, are you ready?" His voice was quiet as he inquired. 6 months before, I had been elevated to Brigadier General. It was still strange to hear him use the title, but today it felt natural. I nodded curtly at him. "Are you ready?" All of the main news networks aired live coverage of the ceremony. I was aware that a big TV, perhaps set to a sports channel, would be on in the private dining area of that Cleveland country club. However, I had made arrangements for a gentle prod. A few minutes earlier, Alex's new father-in-law had received a text message from a friend. "You may wish to activate C-SPAN. At the White House, a significant event is taking place." I was confident that their curiosity and desire to seem knowledgeable would take care of the rest. I imagined that they were watching, maybe in irritation, when the U.S. president took the platform. He started talking about the unsung heroes of the country, the unseen leaders, whose strategic acumen ensures millions of people's safety. Subsequently, I heard the words that would serve as the missile's warhead, which I had so meticulously directed. And this country honors one of the best military strategists of her generation today with the utmost honor and appreciation. The president spoke in a rich, rich voice. Numerous American lives have been saved by the bravery and leadership of an officer who led crucial operations in the War on Terror and was recognized with the Silver Star for outstanding gallantry in battle. My heart pounded a strong, rhythmic beating against my ribs. I anticipated what would happen. The world was going to find out. I have the great honor of introducing Brig. General Rachel Vaughn, and presenting her with the Presidential Medal of Freedom. It was almost visible to me. Alex's self-satisfied smirk froze into disbelief as the clang of a champagne flute fell to the Ohio floor's glossy surface. My mother's hand flew to her mouth in a gesture of utter amazement as the color fled her cheeks. And my father, Robert Vaughn, who labeled me a disgrace and termed my life's work worthless garbage. Now, as he stared blankly at the screen, he watched his daughter, the one he had rejected and written off being honored on national television by the world's most powerful man. The deafening acclaim that broke out in the East Room must have been overpowered by the startled hush in their private gathering. The entire nation was now staring at me and through me, even though they had rendered me invisible. They were examining my family's egregious public failure. I got up from my chair. Every stride towards the stage was sure, steady, and measured. I moved amid the cheers. I have a straight back. I stared straight forward. The president put the medal around my neck after giving me a hard handshake. He leaned closer to me and muttered in my ear, "Buy them seas. This nation has a debt to you that it will never be able to pay back in full." I took a step back, turned to General Vaughn, and gave him the angular, most accurate military salute of my professional life. It was a final silent farewell to my past weakness and a sign of respect for his office. I didn't search for cameras. I didn't use the lens to look for their faces. I turned to face the future I had taken for myself. This was not retaliation. This was enlightening. This was the revelation of truth. It didn't matter anymore that they hadn't allowed me to sit at their table. The history of the United States was now being written with my name on it, and they would never ever be able to go to the celebration. The explosions had just started, but the ritual was over. When I got back to the hotel, my phone, which had been on mute in my purse, lighted up like a switchboard under siege. Numerous calls were unanswered. My mother sent me a barrage of texts. "Why didn't you tell us, Rachel? Call me from Alex, please. We must now speak." It was all capitals now. I watched a silent, frenzied light show flash on the television while perched on the edge of the motel bed. My quiet wasn't the result of their disregard for the first time. It was a decision. It was a weapon. My return companion Dave glanced at the phone and then at me. "How will you respond? Give them time to wait." My voice was calm as I spoke. All my life, they have allowed me to wait. For an entire day, I allowed the calls and texts to accumulate. At last, I took a call from an unfamiliar number. From a friend's phone, it was Catherine, my mother. A stream of hysterical sobbing filled her voice. "Rachel?" Everyone present, the way they gaze upon us. "Your dad, since yesterday, he has not spoken. How have you treated us?" It was almost dull how predictable the charge and the subsequent turn to her own victimhood were. "Mother, I haven't done anything to you." With a cold voice, I said, "I simply went about my life too. Perhaps you could try living yours." Before she could respond, I hung up. A few days later, my hotel room door in Washington, D.C. was frantically knocked on. Through the peephole, I peered. Alex was the one. He had a horrible appearance. His face was tired and pallid, and his pricey suit was creased. I stood in the way of the entrance, but I opened the door. "I apologize," he stumbled. His anxious gaze flitted about. "I was a jerk. I'm so sorry. I had no idea." Then he corrected himself, trailing off. "Really, I had no idea you were that significant there." It was the truth encased in a pitiful pretext of regret. He regretted the public humiliation of being shown to be mistaken, not his harshness. "Alex, let me be clear." I spoke in a calm but firm voice. "You don't feel remorse for the way you handled me. You apologize for your embarrassment. Those two things are very different." He parted his lips to argue and beg. I just stared at him, though. He wasn't invited in. I gave him permission to stand in the corridor. Just as he had allowed me to stand on the edge of his wedding reception, an unwanted stranger was at my door. After a while, he turned and left. That night was the most challenging call. My dad was the one. He didn't say sorry. I got no congratulations from him. That old, annoying authority was still in his voice, but underlying it for the first time, I sensed a tremor of uncertainty. "You get home now, Rachel." He gave an order. "We must resolve this as a family." "Mr. Vaughn, we are no longer a family." With a formal, incisive response, I answered, "You were really clear about that." The phone rang with a howl of unadulterated, helpless anger. "Your father is me. Will you pay attention to me or no?" With a voice as crisp and cold as polished steel, I broke off. "I'm Brigadier General Vaughn, and you're Robert Vaughn. There is nothing else for us to talk about." I ended the call. There was a deep stillness in the room. I had constructed the last wall in that instant. It wasn't composed of stone or brick. It was forged out of respect for oneself. A cue they would never be able to cross again. A week later came the last message. My office forwarded a large handwritten letter from my mother. I held it in my hands for a long time before cutting the envelope open. In her wobbly, looping script, she acknowledged her anxiety, her tacit involvement, and her favoritism. She wrote, "I was always so afraid of your father, fearful of his disappointment, of his rage. To maintain harmony, it was always simpler to agree. Rachel." I went the simpler route. And that route, make a sacrifice for you. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, therefore I'm not pleading for it. I wanted to let you know that I can now see it. I finally get to see it after all these years. The letter didn't make me feel better. The scars of a lifetime were not miraculously healed. However, it carried with it something more. A terrible, bitter ending. She hadn't lost her sight. She had decided not to look. Instead of her daughter, she had opted for her husband. That was the reality. And ultimately, the truth, no matter how agonizing, is a liberation. I officially retired from the U.S. Army a year after the White House ceremony. I never went back to Ohio. I never went back to the dreary gray streets of my youth. Instead, I purchased a modest but solid log home tucked away in the woods on the banks of Chautauqua Lake in upstate New York, using the savings I had meticulously built during a lifetime of service. Here, the tranquility was alive. With a steaming mug of black coffee in my hands, I would sit on my porch's weathered wooden planks every morning and watch the mist rise from the calm, dark sea. The scent of damp ground and pine needles filled the air. All of my adult life had been spent in duty fighting and surrounded by the regimented cacophony of the military. I was at last learning how to simply be in the deep silence of the forest, to survive in silence. I wasn't sitting around. I helped young female veterans make the challenging transition from military to civilian life by volunteering for a mentorship program. In order to help them find their footing and watch them recover their voices from the cacophony of their own pasts, I listened to their experiences, assisted them in turning their hard-won abilities into resumes, and led them through the maze of the VA system. I discovered a new, more subdued form of purpose. Just as I had felt compelled to lay the foundations for my own life, I was assisting them in doing the same. A former specialist called Maria Sanchez, a young woman I had been mentoring, paid me a visit one cool autumn afternoon. She was promoted to sergeant. Her eyes were sparkling with a strength she didn't have when we first saw the general, and her posture was assured. She said, and I felt humbled by the thankfulness in her voice, "It wasn't about tactics or strategy that you taught me the most valuable lesson. It has to do with my own value. I realized that I wasn't broken because of you. My life was saved by you." I went to a little wooden box on my mantelpiece before she departed. I pulled out a penny from my personal challenge. The brass feels cool and hefty in my hand. In her hand, I pressed it. "Sergeant, this is not a gift," I told her in a forceful yet kind voice. "It's an obligation. You keep it until you come across a young soldier who is in greater need of it than you are. The strength is then transferred." As I watched her drive away, her eyes were full of tears, and she closed her fingers around the penny. I was certain deep down in my core of what my real legacy was. It wasn't the title before my name or the decorations affixed to a uniform. This was it. The torch is being passed. From one generation to the next, this tiny silent flame of fortitude was carried on. My fingers came into contact with a forgotten envelope that night as I was organizing an old trunk. It was yellowed with age and crumpled. The letter that my father had written after I had hung up on him. I had never opened that one. I had retained it. I have no idea why. It might have been the last traces of a daughter's interest. One last question mark that lingers. I made a little fire in the stone pit by the lake's side as the sun began to set. The trees were covered in flickering shadows as the flames flared. I felt the weight and history of the letter as I held it in my hands for a long time. What was inside was not necessary for me to know. The explanations, the reasons, the excuses, they were irrelevant now. I didn't write my future in those lines of faded ink. His remorse was not a prerequisite for my peace. I reached out and carefully tucked the unopened envelope into the center of the flames, moving slowly and deliberately. The paper immediately began to curl, turning black at the edges, until orange and gold ate up the entire thing. After a brief burst of brightness, it disintegrated into glowing, weightless ash. The embers were swept away by a gentle breeze that blew off the lake, dispersing them across the glistening water like black stars until they were gone. I stood there for a while, enjoying the cool night air on my face as I watched the fire go out. I was no longer Alex's sister or Robert's daughter. I was no longer a piece of scrap metal or a disgrace. For the first time in my life, I am Rachel Vaughn, a soldier, a mentor, a leader, a survivor. That name alone was more than sufficient. One bright golden light glowed in the window, waiting for me outside as I turned and headed back to my cabin. The world was quiet and dark. There was tranquility within. At last, I was at home, a house I had constructed myself. There, my story finds tranquility, on the lake beside the fire. However, I am aware that many people are still on their trip. Maybe a piece of your own journey resonates with my long journey to create a home within myself. It's a challenging route that may be very isolating, but please be aware of this: you're not by yourself. If you are currently on that road or have a tale of discovering your own strength, please share your thoughts in the comments section below. Your tales give us all the strength to be a part of this community, and your voice matters. Kindly think about enjoying this video and become a Chosen Revenge subscriber for other resilient stories. I appreciate you listening,